last speaker, and Chris will do that for us. Thanks, Chris.
In a manner of speaking.
In a manner of
I found out this morning that I was introducing Dale. I found out this morning I was going first, too. Or late last night. Actually, I think it was the morning by the time Lou's wife told me. Yeah. So some of you in the audience are men, I think, and have wives. And maybe you have these kinds of conversations with your wife. I'll see someone who has been a long-time friend every couple times a year, something like that. And I'll get back, and Jacqueline will say to me, well, you know, how are his kids? And how's his wife? And this and this. And she asks me all these questions, and I say to her, men don't talk about those things at all. So it occurred to me that I've actually known Dale Ahlquist for 70, 80 years now, and you have 4 kids? 6, see? And 6 grandkids?
No grandkids.
Oh, okay. Yeah, okay. So there's proof right there. So here's someone who has been a dear friend of mine, and all you women are going to be completely bored by this introduction because I can't update you on his family at all. But what I can say is this: for the decade that I've known, more than a decade that I've known Dale, and had the good fortune to come to Chesterton Conference and to speak at them, and I was with an organization that I loved dearly for many years, the Rochester Institute, of very, very bright people, and we had wonderful conferences. We did, and I enjoyed them very much. But there is something at Chesterton conferences that is not present at other occasions when those folks who know the truth gather. Because sometimes in meetings such as this, people who know the truth gather, and then they tend to become very pessimistic about the political future of the world. And by the way, you ought to be, I think. But there is something at Chesterton conferences that isn't present at these others. And it's palpable, and it's called joy. And there's a reason for this. Well, there are 2. The first one is Chesterton. He was a joyful man, and so he attracts joyful followers, even from beyond, from the other side of the veil. But there's another reason. There's another reason, and that is the president and founder of the American Chesterton Society, Dale Ahlquist. He is joy personified. He is. And whenever I am in his presence, for me, like these meetings, I say this quite seriously, it is a glimpse of life on the other side of the veil, the fullness of which, the mystical body of Christ, the fullness of which we are going to experience in its full flower when we're united with our Creator. But we get glimpses of it. And sometimes I think my heart is going to explode from being at these conferences and being in Dale's presence. And I say that quite seriously. So, Dale is a TV star. Have you seen those pictures where he's got his cool aviator glasses, the sunglasses, the TV stuff? Do you still wear those? Yeah. He's a stage actor. Get his autograph. He's apparently a pilgrimage leader. Oh, there they are. An author, a father, not a grandfather. He was a lobbyist at one point. We'll just gloss over that, right? But most recently, or not most recently, but within the past 4 or 5 years, 4 years, he is the founder or co-founder and president of Chesterton Academy in beautiful Edina. Now in St. Paul, yeah, which is in a state called Minnesota, which is that way. Anyway, Chesterton Academy was just named one of the top 50 Catholic schools in the United States. All right, here to talk about King Arthur, the greatest king who never was in history, Dale Ahlquist.
that sucked all the joy out of me. So how's the feedback on this? Is it sufficiently irritating, or do we? If I do this, is that better? Huh? Okay. What do you think? Is this normal? Okay. Good. Good. Is it good? Is it? Okay. Very nice. That's what we're going to do with them. You still have a chance to buy a raffle ticket, Jerome. The drawing is on Monday. And we're actually doing a little, we've been doing a big fundraiser for the American Chesterton Society to raise $40,000, which is going to be matched by a matching grant that several people have put up. And we're this close. So if you want to throw some money our way, any other, but also the raffle tickets go towards that. So another incentive to buy a raffle ticket. There you go. Back to our regularly scheduled program. A few years ago, it was about 8 years ago, 9, I went to England with Kurt Griffin back there. There's Kurt. Kurt and I went to England together with a few other people. I had the privilege of leading a Chesterton pilgrimage to England. And one of the places we visited was Glastonbury. And Glastonbury is a fascinating, wonderful place. It was once the site of one of the most beautiful churches in the world. Definitely comparable to Westminster Abbey and Canterbury Cathedral. And just as big, too. And now it is in ruins. Just a few walls of it standing. It was completely destroyed by King Henry VIII's people, and one of their the aristocrat that he gave the land to used bricks from the abbey to build his mansion, which now overlooks the ruins of the abbey. And it's interesting. It's also, Glastonbury is now kind of the center of witchcraft in England, too. Excuse me, Wicca. Sorry. Didn't mean to offend anybody. What's also interesting is that there used to be a Marian shrine there, Our Lady of Glastonbury, which was also completely destroyed, utterly destroyed. The image of Our Lady of Glastonbury was destroyed. They've forgotten what it looked like, but about less than 100 years ago, they found a miniature image of it in France. Thank God for France, Joseph. And so they were able to make a new image of Our Lady of Glastonbury. So now there is a Catholic church that has Our Lady of Glastonbury in it. What a lot of people don't know, and this is part of the history you don't know, is that Glastonbury is the ancient seat of Christianity in England. It goes back all the way in legend to Joseph of Arimathea, who was a wealthy guy because he was a merchant who sailed to England. And so wealthy that he had this tomb. Well, that's another story. But there is one legend that he was actually a distant relative of Jesus and took the Christ child with him to England on one of his trips. And that song that you hear, Jerusalem, lyrics by William Blake. And did those feet in ancient times walk upon England's mountains green? That's what that's referring to. Did those feet in ancient times walk upon England mountains green? The feet of the Christ child. Cool. But one of the other reasons why there's some heft to the legend is the Glastonbury thorn, a tree that is native only to the Holy Land that grows in Glastonbury and has grown there since before any recorded history of it. It's always been there, going back to the earliest days of England. And twice that thorn has been destroyed. It's been cut down, although the remnants of it still grow there. But the main tree was cut down at the same time that the Glastonbury Abbey was destroyed. And the guy who swung the axe the first time, a sliver of it came out and just hit him right in the eye and blinded him. But we don't gloat about those things. But it was actually most recently cut down again, probably about 2 years ago at Christmas. Yeah. Don't know why. I mean, why would people hate the Glastonbury thorn? Just because it represents ancient Christianity in England? I don't know. But what's the most interesting thing about Glastonbury is another thing that almost nobody knows. That it is connected to the most tantalizing figure in all of English history, and that is King Arthur. That once and future king who is so important in legend, but just does not exist in any written accounts. And he somehow eluded the pages of history, even though he's the most famous king in all of English history. Glastonbury is the legendary site of Avalon. And it's also the site of the grave of King Arthur. And like another famous grave in history, the grave is empty. Now, one of the people who was involved in finding this famous empty grave, and who did the most to discover the real King Arthur, was a scholar by the name of Geoffrey Ashe. And Kurt and I had the great privilege of meeting Geoffrey Ashe, and he spoke to our group when we brought our pilgrimage to Glastonbury. He's the world's foremost authority on King Arthur, and he painstakingly followed all the little historical clues to get to the real figure of King Arthur, including finding the grave. And what's so amazing is that he found some really ancient references to the grave, and found that when they had removed the original body and the two coffins of Arthur and Guinevere and put them into the Glastonbury Abbey, where the tomb sat right in front of the high altar. They actually found an inscription that said it was King Arthur's body, and so he was able to, with the help of archaeologists, locate the original grave. The way they could figure out that it was a grave, it's just one of these things that archaeologists can do. They say it's impossible to disguise a hole. But now the question is, why did Geoffrey Ashe pursue King Arthur, the real King Arthur, and even believe there was a real King Arthur, when all the historians had assured him that there was no such person? Well, because he had read G.K. Chesterton. And in Chesterton's short history of England, and in some other things he wrote, he absolutely makes the case that there has to be a real King Arthur, because the legend says so. And Chesterton says, legend is what everybody in the village believes, whereas history is what the one crank who writes it down believes. But why is King Arthur so important? One little parenthesis about Geoffrey Ashe. He also was the one who, in the 1960s, wrote a book on Gandhi, and he was the one who discovered that it was Gandhi reading an illustrated London News column by G.K. Chesterton that inspired him to begin leading a movement for Indian independence. So he was the scholar who first discovered that. All right, but the question now is, why is King Arthur so important? That's what I'm going to try to explain in this talk here. The first thing we have to understand is what Chesterton calls the unlettered interlude in history, known as the Dark Ages. The unlettered interlude in history. Last year I was here and I got to say apocalyptic conflagration. And I don't get to say that very often, so I just wanted to say that again, apocalyptic conflagration. But, another thing I never get to say is that unlettered interlude in history, known as the Dark Ages. Most people, of course, are in the dark about the Dark Ages, and there's some justification for that, because it was that unlettered interlude in history. In other words, there was so little written history, so little written down, that's why it is the Dark Ages. There's just very little recorded fact about it. But they're also in the dark about it because they have it confused with another period in history about which we know a great deal. They somehow get the Dark Ages mixed up with the Middle Ages, which were anything but dark. So the Dark Ages come from about the 5th century to about the 9th century. That's roughly the Dark Ages, the very end of the Roman Empire to the beginning of the Middle Ages, and the rise of medieval Europe. And as I said, there's very little written history, but the other reason it's the Dark Ages is because civilization itself was dark. Things had largely fallen apart. Europe is dotted by a bunch of barbarian tribes that behaved like barbarians, really. They just took whatever they wanted, did whatever they liked, and they did away with whatever they didn't like. And there was really only one remnant of Roman civilization that survived that period, and that actually opposed the barbarians. And that was the Roman Catholic Church. And when Chesterton was in the midst of discovering the Christian faith, he had to deal with one of the common accusations about the church, namely that Christianity belongs to the Dark Ages, that it arose at a time of ignorance, and that the church wants to bring us back to the Dark Ages, if it could. But then, of course, when he examined the actual facts, it turned out to be precisely the opposite. And he says in Orthodoxy, Christianity, so far from belonging to the Dark Ages, was the one path across the Dark Ages that was not dark. It was a shining bridge connecting two shining civilizations. If anyone says that the faith arose in ignorance and savagery, the answer is simple. It didn't. It arose in the Mediterranean civilization in the full summer of the Roman Empire. The world was swarming with skeptics, and pantheism was as plain as the sun when Constantine nailed the cross to the Mass. And then, after being buried under the debris of dynasties and clans, we arose and remembered Rome. If our faith had been a mere fad of the fading empire, fad would have followed fad into the twilight. And if the civilization ever re-emerged, it would have been under some new barbaric flag. But the Christian church was the last life of the old society and was also the first life of the new. She took the people who were forgetting how to make an arch, and she taught them to invent the Gothic arch. In a word, the most absurd thing that could be said about the church is the thing that we have all heard said of it. How can we say that the church wishes to bring us back into the Dark Ages? The church was the only thing that ever brought us out of them. So at the beginning of the Dark Ages, Rome was actually a slave state. A huge portion of the population was indentured to a small, wealthy ruling class. By the Middle Ages, slavery had disappeared throughout almost all of medieval Europe. There was a large majority of free, self-sufficient peasants. At the beginning of the Dark Ages, there were no universities, no hospitals, and no beautiful cathedrals. By the beginning of the Middle Ages, or by the Middle Ages, that all these things had developed, and most of those beautiful cathedrals still stand. The accusation, of course, is false. The church wants to bring us back to the Dark Ages. But the fact is, the Dark Ages are returning. And very few people really ask the question honestly or answer it honestly. Is our civilization improving or is it declining? And for the last 2 centuries, the loudest thinkers have always been telling us that things are improving, even rapidly improving. And this is in large part because of the rise of industrialism, the impressive advances in technology, medicine, communication. I mean, how can you argue against any of those things? Well, that's what I'm going to do right now. I mean, we've seen the advances, but every great thing that we've achieved always comes at a price. None of it is just a free gift. We've paid a heavy price for every great advance that we've experienced in our civilization. The Industrial Revolution brought great social blight, great human oppression. Technology has not only given us bigger and better machines, it's also given us bigger and better war machines and better ways to kill people. And we've killed people on the most impressive scale in all of history in the last century. Even medicine that was designed to preserve life has found sophisticated ways to take away life. And medicine has gone from being the art of healing to an industry that has produced wealth and power and even another form of oppression called health care. And communication, of course, is just amazingly improved, but as Chesterton said, we've come up with the best communication forms in all of history precisely at the moment when we have nothing to say. And of course, what these forms of communication have also given us are these new forms of electronic addiction. The term, Christopher Check gave a great talk on e-slavery at one of our Chesterton conferences a couple years ago. But, you know, I know that at the beginning of my day, I take out the handcuffs and I handcuff myself to the laptop until I'm allowed to go free at the end of the day and get something to drink, because that's when I really need it. And I love how they said email was going to make our life easier and give us more time. I'm still waiting for that. I mean, they had to have been right when they said that, right? Because I'm going to have more time pretty soon because of email, right? Of course, select all delete is an option. That would give me the rest of the day off, wouldn't it? But we don't hear the counter-arguments using any of these things getting better. We never hear the counter-argument, and that's because we are caught up in a philosophy that is called progressivism. The other word for it is Darwinism. The sense that everything's always going to get better. There's nothing we have to do about it because it will just get better. Chesterton says, I think that the chief modern danger, I used to think the chief modern danger was a danger of over-civilization. I'm inclined to think now that the chief modern danger is that of a slow return towards barbarism. Civilization in the best sense merely means the full authority of the human spirit over all the externals. Barbarism means the worship of those externals in their crude and unconquered state. Barbarism means the worship of nature. And in recent poetry, science, and philosophy, there's been too much of a worship of nature. Whenever men begin to talk with great solemnity about the forces outside man, the note of it is barbaric. When men talk much of heredity and environment, they are barbarians. Modern men of science, many of them, are barbarians. That is why they remain squalid and unhappy, always talking about heredity, always talking about environment. The true savage is a slave and is always talking about what he must do. The civilized man is a free man and talks about what he may do. Chesterton's argument is that civilization is based on the dignity of man, and the dignity of man is based on the principle of free will. And the basis of barbarism is determinism, that our fate is in the stars or in the earth or in our blood or in something that we simply cannot control. And when we start blaming our behavior on our parentage or on our poverty or on our wealth or on the weather or on anything that we can't control, then we are moving towards the new dark ages. And barbarism is on the rise. It means that we start looking for excuses to do whatever we want. And we don't live in a truth-seeking age. We start living in simply a pleasure-seeking age. And Chesterton says some modern writers, it seems to me, do not so much attack all that is bad in civilization as admire all that is bad in barbarism. And he's not surprised to see artists kind of sign on, and the entertainers and the educated sign on and drawn nearer and nearer to this state of savagery, because he says they're purposely rebelling against civilization. And they're not rebelling against the corruption of the institutions, but against the institutions themselves. They're rebelling, he says, against marriage, against courtesy, and a code of justice. And they follow these fatalistic tendencies, the tendencies of the savage. And it's the savages whose temptations are to be terrorized by monstrous and merely obscure things. And so they grow unhappy, restless, hostile, full of doubt, ignorance, in a word, agnostic. They live in darkness. It's the new dark ages. And so we're faced right now with the triumph of the new barbarians. We're facing a social anarchy. And when we see that everything's done on account of pleasure or pain, when the reason for doing things are completely irrational, when everything's attributed to taste, there's no intellectual debate anymore. There's this growing obsession with nature, with this vague goddess of Mother Nature. We're fighting a battle where people don't even want to engage it intellectually. And what Chesterton says is so interesting. He says it's not only an attack on the faith, something we talked about this morning. It's the enemy is unbelief. Chesterton says there's also this attack against reason. And he says in the first dark ages, the arts and the sciences all went into sanctuary, literally. It was the monasteries that preserved the arts and preserved the sciences and preserved all of man's cultural accomplishments, provided a shelter for the good, the true, and the beautiful. And he says in the new dark ages, there's going to have to be another institution besides the church that has to protect civilization, that provides sanctuary for both faith and reason. And that institution is the family. And this is why he spent so much time defending not only the family, but the thing that can give the family independence, private property. And he says, I believe at this historic crisis, property has become not only a just thing, but a sacred thing. Real property will be all the more sacred because it'll be all the more rare. It'll be an island of Christian culture in seas of senseless drifting and mutable social moods. In short, I believe we have reached a time when the family will be called upon to play the part once played by the monastery. That is to say, there will retire into it not merely the peculiar virtues that are its own, but the crafts, the creative habits which once belonged to all sorts of other people. Okay, well that's my introduction. Now what does all this have to do with King Arthur? In fact, what do we even know about King Arthur? Well, according to Chesterton, King Arthur was celebrated by every generation of English culture since the Middle Ages, and it was only in the modern ages where his whole status and persona really started becoming more vague and sketchy. In fact, we've certainly seen it, in his own time, Chesterton referred to the Victorians as referring to Arthur as this kind of romantic, wistful figure. And Mark Twain has a King Arthur story where it just totally gets King Arthur wrong, basically has the court of Arthur being barbaric. And since Chesterton's time, we've seen King Arthur in forms of entertainment. That horrible thing that happened in the 1960s, Camelot. I just had this image of Vanessa Redgrave, and it just always turns my stomach. Oh. Of course, Monty Python did their thing with it. There was a King Arthur movie about 8 years ago with Clive Owen that got one thing right about King Arthur. They had it in the right time period. They actually had King Arthur in the right time period, but they made him into a Pelagian, for no reason. So they make him a hero and a heretic, and of course his knights were as barbaric as any of the barbarians. Although there was one good line in that movie. How's that? My son Julian actually had the great courage to get up and walk out of that movie, and I still admire him for doing that, because I had to sit there and say, no, I paid for this movie. Watch the whole thing. I mean, I sat through the whole Vanessa Redgrave thing. I could sit through this. There's one line where the barbarian and Arthur stand off, and face off to each other, and then they're going to have their big fight, and Arthur turns away and walks away, and the barbarian savage lord says, "Finally, a man worth killing." But they tried to make a whole movie based on one good line. It doesn't work. And then, one of the best things on King Arthur in recent history, the Disney cartoon. Disney usually manages to massacre and destroy everything it touches, but the Disney cartoon actually gets the legend quite right and entertaining. But the point about these resources is that they've created the more fog over Avalon, and what Chesterton gets at is that the legend has to be based on a real King Arthur, because he says, historically speaking, the point about a popular legend is whatever made it popular. And most people are interested in a hero because he's a hero, because he's heroic. He says no other explanation is needed, because no other explanation explains anything. Every other explanation fails to explain. And Chesterton says the earliest historical references to Arthur are references to what he did. And what he did was defend Britain as a Christian and civilized state against the heathen invasions. And the very first references to him deal with stories like the Battle of Mount Badon, in which Arthur drove the heathen before him and carried a holy image. And all of the things that strike Chesterton about King Arthur that have the ring of reality to them is that they always refer to real places and real objects and real things. And even if the names of those places aren't connected to anything that are known, they're referred to as real places. He says there's a sense of there-ness about them. There really is a there. And he says that the modern objections to that legend and all the modern doubts about Arthur, he says, are founded on the notion that anything so far back in time must have itself been barbaric. But the truth is that if it's far enough back, it would certainly have been civilized. It would have been in the last phase of the old Roman civilization. If you go back far enough into the night, you get to the previous day. If you go back far enough into the Dark Ages, you get to the light that is still coming from Rome. King Arthur stands in Britain at once as the first of the Britons and the last of the Romans. Now, there are three important objects associated with Arthur that explain both his legendary status, but also his real importance. The first is his sword, the second is the Round Table, and the third is the Holy Grail. And I would argue that they represent the three things that are needed to preserve civilization against the new Dark Ages. The sword representing purposeful craftsmanship, the Round Table representing political and domestic order, and the Holy Grail, of course, representing authentic religion. Let's take them one at a time quickly. The sword, Chesterton, of course, liked swords. He liked them because they came to a point. But he says, on every sword that is made by man, while the workshops of the world turn out that terrible kind of cutlery, ought to be graven the two mysterious phrases which were on the sword of King Arthur, Excalibur. On one side was written, "Take me," and on the other, "Cast me away." If no more than this dim fable recalled the doubtful hero of Camelot, we should know that he defended Christendom against the heathen. For the highest mark of Christian civilization is this capacity for feeling that the sword is at once noble and unnatural. The sword is the symbol of a two-edged truth, that defense is a duty, but that we must hold the sword and not let the sword hold us. We have to be able to hold our tools and not let them hold us, which means we have to be as free to pick them up as free to throw them away. And whenever the sword becomes more important than the person holding it, and even more important than the person being struck by it, then we have become barbarians. The second object associated with Arthur is the Round Table. And Chesterton says the Round Table represents heroic comradeship, the image of men who are willing to feast together, to argue together, to serve together, and to govern together. The sword is a symbol of war. The table is a symbol of peace. And the Round Table, of course, is not only a symbol of universality, but of equality. The idea of the king who is our equal. It's the basis of the idea that all men are kings, which, of course, is the basis of the idea of democracy. Chesterton's a defender of common sense and a defender of the common man, which is why he is a defender of democracy. The idea that the most important decision should be left to normal people, and the idea of self-government which also means self-control, which is the basis of democracy. Freedom means responsibility. The two things that people always separate from each other have to go together, freedom and responsibility. But Chesterton always is arguing that the common man is entitled to rule himself, to make the most important decisions in life for himself, and not have them made by the government or by anyone else. In the Round Table, it represents not only democracy, but domesticity, order. It represents civilization against the barbarians. And then the third and the most mysterious object associated with Arthur is the Holy Grail. Part of that legend of Joseph of Arimathea is that when he came to England, he brought with him the cup from the Last Supper, the chalice. And in subsequent centuries, it was lost. And the legend is that Joseph of Arimathea, probably around the 5th century, appeared to King Arthur and sent him on a quest to find it. And of course, the Holy Grail is a symbol that is more than a symbol, because it is the object that held the wine that Christ himself consecrated as his blood. And it represents, in that sense, all the sacraments. It represents the church itself, the reality of the Christian revelation. And when he sends Arthur looking for the Grail, there's a symbol that we are all sent on this quest. And it's something that we go looking for every day, and we get to find it every day. And the only one who ever is granted a vision of, who actually ever gets to see it, is who? Galahad, the pure. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. The sacramental nature of the Catholic faith, the idea that something spiritual and eternal is embodied in something physical and ephemeral. Did I mention yet the unlettered interlude? It's always a profound mystery. We talked about history today being that point where eternity meets time, right? And that's what every sacrament is too. And King Arthur, his whole story is filled with that idea of this supernatural encounter. Chesterton says there's a thrill to that story, that there's some strange spot on earth where the sky touches heaven, where the sky touches the earth, where the earth touches heaven, and where eternity, he says, contrives to live on the borderland of time and space. And he also points out the fact that King Arthur, he is more real to England than even the historical King Alfred, who really is a character just like King Arthur, who defends civilization against the barbarians and saves civilization. And why Alfred is called Alfred the Great, the only English king with the epithet the Great. And of course, the basis of Chesterton's wonderful poem, The Ballad of the White Horse. A poem that you should all study. And the great thing about the poem, among other great things, is the way Chesterton ends it with Alfred making a prediction about the future. He predicts that the barbarians will return, not in warships, not with blood on their hands, but with books as weapons and ink on their hands. And they'll bring ruin and darkness again with destructive ideas, by being bound to nothing, being slaves without a lord, by one blind idiot world obeyed, too blind to be abhorred, by terror and the cruel tales of curse in bone and kin, by weird and weakness winning, accursed from the beginning, by detail of the sinning and denial of the sin. Chesterton says we're fighting this new false religion that could be called a religion of irreligion, that trusts itself utterly to the anarchy of the unknown, an attack on faith and reason, and it's capable of destroying civilization unless we stop it. Which brings us to the final point of why King Arthur is important. He's called the once and future king, because there's the legend of his return. And I know there's some stray Englishmen here who think that there's a real king of England out there. But part of the legend of King Arthur is that the real king is going to return. And Chesterton has a wonderful poem called The Grave of Arthur, where he sort of combines the story of Christ with the story of Arthur and points out the interesting similarities. Arthur's Christ-like qualities, his seemingly supernatural kingship, and the whole legend of his return, and the heroic qualities, and the chivalry and honor and bravery and self-sacrifice that are so important, because those are the heroes that we need if we're going to enter a new dark ages, which we are entering. And we have to be those heroes. And so, says Chesterton, there is a glorious side to social decline. Its name is King Arthur. And we are beginning to understand what it would mean to stand up to the last for the higher ideals of social reform amid a world going down into ruin, negation, and apathy, beginning to realize what it means to be men of the barbarian decline, to resist that decline, and fight for civilization and citizenship, and why they remained through the darkness of the barbarian end, burning and shining lights of the legends of romance and stories of chivalry. They remained because they fought to save civilization. It is well that they should still fight for their civilization to the last, even if they thought it was going down. They would thus be more prepared when the great things returned. And so, let us be heroes. Let us be King Arthur. Chesterton says, if there are ghastly things to be faced, the only thing we can do to make it glorious is to face them. God bless you all. Let's fight this battle together.
Thanks very much, Dale. And thank you all for attending our 9th annual conference. There's one little minor detail. There's a pink notebook missing, 6 by... What's it in metric? I mean, you're from Canada. What's it in metric?